What's up, guys? We got another episode of Garageaholics E30 N54 swap right here. Today we're going to be installing 5 and 4 lug hubs onto this so that my customer AK can have 5 lug wheels on his E30 N54. Let's get into it. We're going to be doing installation, we're going to be doing the calculations, and then we're going to be doing a quick test drive. Test drive is not going to be very eventful because basically you're just installing new hubs with new bearings and that's it. We are going to be keeping the 4 lug wheels for now, as you can see, but my customer wants to go to 5 lug wheels in the future, and this gives him that opportunity. So let's talk about the products. Special thanks to Clipz Motorsport, Clipz with a Z. Go check them out down in the description. They're the ones who provided us the hubs to try and test and review. So hopefully we'll see how these things perform, but thanks a lot, guys, for giving us the opportunity to do this on this E30 N54. So we've got our front hubs, we've got our rear hubs with our bearings, our sleeves, our bolts, our lock rings. These are incredibly butch. I mean, these things are really, really thick, at least over ½ inch thick. This is a cross-drilled 5x120 and a 4x100, as you can see. And in a couple of areas, the bolt pattern gets quite close, but there is no way to avoid that with a dual bolt pattern. And the same thing for the rears. The rears actually include new bearings and sleeves to adapt from the old the smaller bearing size to the new bearing size for E30s, and also, of course, the hardware as well. At first look, I mean, these are really nice looking bearings. I mean, the whole setup looks like it's relatively high quality, good quality materials. There is a chamfer built on the backside of the rear hub for allowing your brake rotors to get installed and everything like that, and that's one of the main reasons why it's not possible to go to a larger diameter, which is why a lot of people in the enthusiast community have an issue with the edge distance from the 5x120 out to the outer circumference, is because of the edge distance. And I will show you guys with the calculations why, and the forces and the hub centricity of these, that should not even be a concern at all, and how you can make up for that with the thickness of the material. It's got the same spline shaft for the axle to go through, just like you'd normally see in a regular hub. It's basically just dual drilled. That's basically the main difference here between the stock hubs and these hubs. So comes with new hardware as well, new snap rings, and yeah, that's basically it. The fronts are a bit of a different story. These are really butch here. Comes with a proprietary pressed bushing assembly design. If you do have problems or issues with these, you can always go back to Clipz Motorsport and get these fixed for any reason whatsoever. They will take care of you, no problems, no questions asked. But yeah, these are really good. This is a really good setup. All right, guys, so now let's go into the calculations that I have devised for figuring out whether or not these hubs are good for this application. We have our hub, okay? It's both 4x100 and 5x120, but we're gonna concentrate on the green here, the 5x120, because nobody's really buying these things just to have 4x100. There's no point. So we're gonna focus on that. This 2.17 inch dimension from the center to the center of the outer hole on 5x120 is 2.17 inches, but we'll get to that later. First, let's talk about the fundamentals. When you torque a hub, you need to torque it to a specified torque value. In this case, we have an M12 by 1.5 thread bolt. We have 5 of them. 10.9 is its strength rating. When you talk about the advisable torque, you're talking about the diameter of the actual bolt and the torque that it can handle. BMW recommends 90 foot-pounds or 1,080 inch-pounds for torque, specified for the lug bolt. Basically, every car has that, or very, very similar torque value. When you identify how much clamping force one bolt takes onto 2 pieces of material and how much clamping a certain thread pitch and size of a bolt has, we talk about this formula. The force that is applied is equal to the torque divided by K, which is like a constant for the frictional force between two different materials. In the case of aluminum and steel, aluminum, and aluminum, whatever, you're talking about something roughly about 0.2, which is a plain dry surface, no lubrication, and it's basically a metal-to-metal contact. And then you have D. D is the cross-sectional area of the bolt that you're talking about. The cross-sectional bolt of an M12 by 1.5 is approximately 0.47, or basically half of an inch squared. We talked about the torque already, and we talked about the coefficient of friction. So now you have you apply that into your force, and you're talking about 1,080 inch-pounds divided by 0.2 times 0.47. That equals roughly 11,000 pounds of clamping force down per bolt. Now remember, we have 5 of them, so you multiply that by 5, and that is approximately 57,000 pounds of force that's being applied between the wheel and your hub. 57,000 pounds is basically the weight of an armored vehicle. Now let me try to demonstrate this in terms of gravity. Okay, there are no bolts, no lug bolts in this example. This is just a hub that is sitting stationary and a wheel that is hub-centrically centered along that hub. But this wheel weighs 57,000 pounds pushing down on the hub, right? Pushing down. There is a torque value that will overcome the force of 57,000 pounds on top of this. We don't know what that value is, but there is a value that we can calculate that figures out how much torque needs to be applied such that you can actually get one piece of metal moving along the other when that much weight is applied in between the two. So what is that value and why is it important? Well, that leads us to the next step of the calculations, the torque required to overcome that friction. So now that we've dealt with the clamping force applied by the 5 lug bolts on 2 pieces of material, we can now talk about the torque required to turn one piece of material over the other that's assumed to be stationary, essentially the hub and the wheel. I'm not a calculus professor, and it took me a long time to understand this, so I'm going to try to explain it the best that I can. Essentially, you have your hub, just like this, and it has an inner radius and an outer radius, and when you're trying to spin it to overcome the friction, you have an inner moment and an outer moment, and any point contained within that surface area of contact is known as the point. And what we want to do is use the formula, the sum of the moments is equal to the integral of the moment across the area that we're concerned about. And that area has an inner radius and an outer radius defined here and here for the actual E30 rear hubs. When you integrate over the area, you're basically integrating the frictional force times the pressure of that area across its changing radius. So what's not changing? We have mu that's not changing, that's our static coefficient of friction, and we have our pressure, which is equal to force over area. So we can take that and bring it out of the equation, and then we can figure out exactly what we're going to be integrating over the radius. So you have your mu, you have your static coefficient of friction, you have your force, which is essentially your 50,000 pounds of force against those 2 pieces of material, and your area. Your force over area is equal to pressure. And then when you're actually integrating is the radius over the area, which in this case is going to be the circumference, pi times the diameter. So when you bring that over and bring it out, when you find the area of the actual contact, you're basically dealing with the outer radius and the inner radius. The area of this mating surface area is basically pi r squared. In this case, we're taking the outer radius squared minus the inner radius squared, multiplying it by pi. And now what we're left with here is integrating from inner radius to outer radius of r times 2 pi r dr. So when you do all that calculus, you actually figure out that you're dealing with 2 pi r squared. 2 pi r squared is essentially, when you're dealing with r squared, it ends up becoming, and this is something that you kind of memorize, is basically r cubed over 3. And if you were to derive that, you take the 3, bring it here, bring this down to a 2, and then these cancel out, and now you're back with r squared. So in the case of integrating, you're doing the opposite of deriving. You're basically doing r cubed over 3, okay? And it's obviously, you're left with your 2 pi. So when you bring that all over here, right, your pi's cancel out. You're left with your 2/3 times your mu times your force, and then you have outer radius cubed minus inner radius cubed over outer radius squared minus inner radius squared. You plug in the values, and what you have here is 5,842 foot-pounds. That means that you need to apply 5,800 foot-pounds of force just to get it to move, let alone not even talking about lugs being on, right? That's just force pushing down on something else. That's incredible. Most engines don't even have that capability. So when I am thinking about installing these hubs and putting them on 5-lug, I am not concerned about shearing any bolts. In fact, let's talk a little bit about the shear strength of these bolts at a 10.9 safety strength factor, and what is the actual force being applied to that lug, and whether or not we can figure out if for some reason you are able to generate that amount of torque to get these just to move, then what would happen to the bolts. So let's talk about that. So now we're at the very end of our calculations, and that's safety factor. Safety factor is essentially a measure to understand how much margin you have in your design. Here, to calculate our safety factor, we want to take that 5,800 foot-pounds of torque and figure out if you were to break through that, how much force would actually be on the bolt at that value, and then compare it to what the bolt in the metal is actually rated for. So when you're talking about force, force is equal to torque over the distance that it's being applied. In this case, we have a distance of 2.17 inches from the center of rotation to the center of the bolt of a 5x120 bolt pattern. In that case, the 5,800 foot-pounds corresponds to about 70,000 inch-pounds of force over the 2.17 inches. The inches cross out, and you're dealing with 32,306 just pounds of force. And you got 5 bolts. So you're dealing with that each bolt is taking on 1/5 of that load, so that is about 6,400 pounds. Now, mind you, that is 6,400 pounds acting exactly normal to the bolt. It's not hitting it at an angle, it's not hitting it from the side or above or below, it's hitting it concentrically from the center of rotation of the hub. So it's constantly pushing at that angle into the side of the bolt. But now that we have the force that's acting on each of these bolts, and we know the size of the bolt, and we know what it's rated for, because it's a 10.9 bolt, that's a measure of strength of the bolt, that can handle about 150,000 PSI of strength before it starts to yield. When you're dealing with the shear force on a bolt, you want to take the force that's being applied over the area, the square, the cross-sectional area of that bolt. The cross-sectional area of an M12 by 1.5 is approximately 0.173 inches squared. When you take our force divided by the area, you're left with about 37,000 PSI of force that's being acted on that bolt hubcentrically. I need to stress that. Very, very important. Nobody relies on the bolts to do the holding of the, to take on the shear of the force. It's always the hubcentricity applied with the clamping force that really holds your wheels together. Safety factor is very simple. All you do is you take your 150 that it's rated for, divide it by the actual applied force or area, and you're left with a unitless number. In this case, we're dealing with a safety factor of 4. And that is if you're able to overcome this much torque. Now that we have all of this information, there are still a few unanswered questions. Not that I want to try to dispel every theory, because I'm not saying that I'm pro this or pro that. I wanted to try a product and see how it worked in application. And oh, by the way, before installing it, I wanted to do a couple of calculations just to give me a good feeling of what I'm installing has the strength to handle what it's going to end up needing to deal with in application. But there are questions about edge distance. And yes, the edge distance of the hole to the outside edge of the outer diameter of the hub is very close. How do you make up for that? By having a really thick piece of material. There's like 5 or 6 threads of engagement on the hub at this location. So when you torque it down to spec, those threads are making a really strong engagement onto the hub. And the edge distance really doesn't even come into play very much when you're dealing with those values. So this entire analysis relies on 2 major factors being adhered to. First, that each and every bolt is getting torqued to the 90 foot-pounds that's recommended. And the second thing is that there is hub centricity. There's concentric installation of the hub, of a spacer, of the wheel, and if you have to use hub-centric spacers, it is incredibly highly recommended to do that, because if you don't do that, then you are going to be relying on the lugs to do the centering, and that is a huge, huge no. So yes, you need to have hub centricity, you need to have your lugs torqued, and a lot of these equations apply with a good and impressive safety factor. So now that we've gone through the boring stuff, let's go through the installation. Let's take a look at these things, let's put them on the car, and then let's go for a drive. So the fronts we'll start with first. Bearing and the hub are one complete assembly. You got to remove the rotor, the caliper bracket, and the hub should literally pull out. So we'll be able to get that out pretty easily by removing this dust cap, unscrewing the, I believe, 30 millimeter or 27 millimeter bolt, and it should come right out as a full assembly, and then put the new one back in. So as I thought, everything came as one assembly, rotor and the hub just kind of fell off, which leads me to this, which is basically just one of the inner races of the bearing still left, and this dust shield. If you look at the new hub, the backside has a diameter that's larger than this, so we can actually remove this dust shield from the hub and the inner race as well. So we can either cut it or we can just chisel it out. But I want to try chiseling it out first before I cut it because I think that's just going to be a little bit safer. But if you do cut it, we're going to end up using a cutoff wheel and slicing along the edge, which expands the metal on this inner race, and you can just basically pull it out easily that way. So let's try the non-invasive way first. So now we've got to put our dust shield back on. Actually, some would argue that you really don't even need the dust shield at all, but we are going to be, as you can see, going back to a stock setup the way it was, just adding this hub. So I want to make sure that the shield is back in place, and now we can press the new hub back on. Okay? And you can see the CAD coated hub in the inside there, and the 5 other lugs are there. We put the factory E30 brake stuff back on. We're gonna be upgrading brakes later in another episode. But for now, this is exactly what we want, and I am very happy with the results so far, and I guess we just have to move on to the back. All right, so now that the fronts are done, now we can start focusing on the rears. Notoriously, the rears are harder, and either it's going to be not that bad or really bad, depending on how much rust or corrosion is on the hub to prevent it from coming out. So first what we need to do is remove obviously the rotor and the brake caliper and the caliper bracket, but we're going to need to unscrew this and get the half shaft out and pushed out. So we got to get that old bearing out. There's no way you're going to be able to replace the hub without replacing the rear bearing. And the rear bearing comes with the kit from Clipz Motorsports. All right, so first is removing the rear caliper. Got to remove the rear anti-rattle clip, and then your 2 7mm on the back side, which I had already removed, and then it should just jiggle itself loose. Okay. All right. So now we got to remove the half shaft. In order to do that, you got 8mm Allen, and you got to remove all these, and then you have to suspend the half shaft so it's kind of sitting. That way, when you push the half shaft through, it has room to go. But we're not really removing the half. Oh, I guess we can remove the half shaft, but yeah, we do have to remove it from here first and foremost. Half shaft is removed at the diff end. Now we need a 30mm and just drive it out. There you go. Okay. This is probably one of my favorite pullers. Works directly with the E30 hub. Screw it in there. Screw it in there. Tighten them up. The half shaft will end up getting pushed aside, so we're gonna have to probably discard that or put it down somewhere and out of the way. But this is a really, really good hub puller used for doing that type of stuff. Let's see how it works. All right, so what I got here is kind of a rigged setup to pull the hub out from the backside. I'm going to be using the brake dust shield as the opposing force, which might destroy the brake dust shield, but it might not. So it's probably going to be repairable, which is good. But if not, I do have a spare brake dust shield that I can use and reinstall and make sure that the e-brake setup is exactly the way it was before we started. So let's just keep on going and see if we can pull this puppy out. And it's already pulling out. I can already see it. There we go. And we did not destroy the brake dust shield. Good. How long did that take, AK? So there were two different types of bearings that were used for the BMW E30. The larger inner race size and then a smaller inner race size. This here is accommodating both. And if you end up having a system that has the larger inner race size, like this, they provided a sleeve that gets pressed on and it goes on just like that, so that the right diameter is setting in place. Now let's take a look at the outer race. The outer race looks like it's going to fit perfectly in there. So I think we're in good shape to remove the lock ring and to pull the bearing out from the inner race on the back side, and it should just pull right on out and we can push the new one right back in. So now we have to pull the old bearing out, which now that we've removed the lock ring should be a pretty easy thing to do. The system setup here is that this guy is going to be pushed up against this surface here, just like that. That is what's going to end up being the opposing force to pulling the bearing out. This guy is going to be going and screwing in from behind, where you can see right here, this guy is going to be pulling in from behind on the inner race of the bearing, and that's what's going to drive it out. So this is basically going to be set up just like this, right? And it's going to drive the bearing into this area, and that's how we're going to do it. So I have my shop press basically set up to push in the sleeve onto the inner race of the hub, and if I just start pushing down, you'll see it'll just go right in. It's a really nice interference fit, actually. Okay, done. Now the bearing will fit really nice onto the hub. So we're pressing in the second one and having a quick discussion as to why the sleeve is actually incorporated and not just making this diameter thicker to accommodate the bearing. Sounds like that would be a lot easier, because I don't think that a lot of people have a press that they can just press a sleeve onto a hub. So it sounds to me like it would just be a little bit easier if they just made this a wider diameter, included the hub as part of the purchase, because you have to replace the hub, the bearing regardless, and you would then eliminate this step. So even though we have to do it, it seems like it would make it a little bit easier if the design was incorporated, maybe another dash level revision or something that would be available for new customers that would have, the wider diameter already in place in the design, include the bearing with it. That way you eliminate a step in the installation. So we have our setup for getting the new bearing in, and this is gonna basically push in like that. And it's gonna be using the back side of the hub as the opposing force to then drive this in. And that's how we're gonna do it. So the entire rear is back set up, except of course we got to get the shock mount. So we got to jack up the trailing arm in order to get the shock mount to install in this area there. So that's going to be something we do next. Now let's put her on the ground and let's see how it looks. I mean, it's not going to look any different. It's not going to feel any different, but then we can go take it for a test drive. Should have been recording that deer. Guys, that just about does it for us today on this episode. Thanks a lot, AK, for the help working on getting these hubs replaced. I hope you guys enjoyed the review of these hubs. Thanks to Clipz Motorsports for providing the hubs. This is a really good learning experience for us, and hopefully, we're an early adopter to this, and that time will tell about how the quality of these hubs actually last. But hey, you got brand new bearings, you got brand new hubs, and now you have the option to have 5 lug wheels with an E30 offset, which really helps to widen the amount of wheel choices that you can use. And we are going to be changing these wheels out for something. Not sure what he's gonna choose yet, but he's definitely thinking about it for spring of next year. So we got a lot of cool stuff coming up on this car even still. Guys, thanks a lot for watching. My name is Frank, this is AK, and we're out of here, man. Later.